This is our third module here talking about state legislative development and diversity around the country. And we want to take a look here at some interesting stuff related to the structure of state legislators. So we're going to take a look at the size, unicameralism versus bicameralism, and partisan versus nonpartisan. And then at the end we'll talk a little bit about single member versus multi-member districts. All right, so if you take a look at the size of state legislatures, the average House size is about 100 members and the average Senate size is about 40 members. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a great diversity. If we take a look at the Senate, the smallest kind of state legislative building is the Alaska Senate with only 20 people. And then the largest, and this is second only to the United States House of Representatives, is the New Hampshire legislature with 400 different people in it. And as you can see down there in the right-hand corner, that's a picture of the New Hampshire State Assembly, the State House in session with all those people sitting around. In Pennsylvania, we tend to have legislators a little bit larger than most. The Senate is not all that far off the average or the norm, but our House at 203 members is the second largest House in the United States when it comes to state legislatures, 203 people. There are a number of bills in recent years that have attempted to be able to lower the size of that, but you can imagine the difficulty in being able to say to somebody, hey, we're going to change the size of the legislature, which means essentially you're no longer going to have a seat. So nobody's really going to go along with that. It's a difficult kind of thing to do. All right. Now, there are a couple of arguments for and against large and small legislators, not all of which are mutually exclusive. So some people take one aspect of an argument and seem to turn it on both sides. So here we see some of the arguments for a larger legislature. So the more members that you have, the fewer the constituents for each individual member, meaning that they're closer to the people, right? They're more likely to have face-to-face dealings with those people. In fact, if we took a look at the size of the California state legislature, their districts within their state senate are actually larger than U.S. House districts. It's very difficult for them to deal on a local basis with their constituents. So the bigger the body, the more representatives there are, the closer they are to the people that they represent. There's a feeling that one party can more easily dominate a smaller sized legislature. In addition to that, there might be increased regional rivalries, particularly between rural and urban areas. Districts can be drawn in such a way as to incorporate rural areas into suburban areas or urban areas, meaning that there'd be less rural representation. That's one of the things that people oftentimes worry about with a smaller legislature. In general, most people don't know anything about state government to begin with. So the idea that a smaller legislature makes it more prestigious and everybody knows who these people are probably isn't the case, right? One of the things that people talk about is the idea that if we have a smaller legislature, it'll work more functionally and it'll work a little bit more neatly. But the reality is, proponents for a large legislature say, this is supposed to be a messy process. That's what democracy's about, right? You should have a lot of different points of view. With a larger legislature, you have, smaller districts, and they represent more closely the different interests around the state. And as a consequence of that, you get a better representative democracy. Right? And then finally, the idea is that if you have more people, you can have more areas of specialization, more people that are knowledgeable about specific areas of policy, which produces better outcomes for the policy as a consequence of that. Now, obviously, on the flip side, there are a number of arguments for a smaller state legislature, right? One of those things is just because you have a larger district doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be responsive to people, right? Particularly in a professionalized state legislature, if you've got staff that can help out with constituency issues, it doesn't really matter the size of the state legislature, right? We no longer rely on old-fashioned means of technology. It's very easy to interact with people. So it doesn't mean that you're less responsive. One of the arguments is that the less seats that you have, the more competitive those seats will be. right? So, if you go from having 203 seats down to, say, having 101 seats, there are going to be more people from those districts because they're a larger size running for these seats, which will mean that we'll get better qualified people and you'll have more competitive races. In addition to that, because of the fact that there will be less seats in the state legislature, they'll be more prestigious, right? It'll be more meaningful to be a member of the state legislature, all right? Because they'll be, they'll be more responsible and so forth. One of the things that's discussed is oftentimes in very large legislatures, so much of the decision making is done off of the floor. It's done by party leaders. It's done in caucuses, and it's done behind the scenes. If we had a smaller state legislature, things could be done more in the open. Individuals would have more information. We could actually see the debates that are going on and have better discussion, where each person had more of an input. Larger legislatures, according to the small legislature crowd, create more committees, and that means that there's less input by the average state legislator. And then finally, it costs a lot of money if you've got a very large legislature, particularly if it happens to be a professionalized state legislature, because you got to pay for legislative services in the state capitol for people, staff in the state capitol, and then you have to also pay for people back in the district to have district offices and all of their pensions and so forth and so on, right? So those are the arguments between the large and the small legislatures. The other thing that we talk about is the idea of having a unicameral or a bicameral legislature. Now, this is pretty much an open and shut case in the United States when it comes to the state level. Interestingly enough, 49 out of the 50 states have a bicameral state legislature, meaning that they've got something. It's not always called the same thing, but it's called, typically the House of Representatives or the Senate. And only one state has a unicameral state legislature. That is the state of Nebraska. And in 1934, in the midst of the Great Depression, they went unicameral. The idea is that it was a much simpler, transparent process whereby there were no shenanigans among different interest groups playing one house off versus the other, and they passed that in 1934. There haven't been any other states that have adopted that since then, right? Which is kind of interesting. We have this kind of bias towards checks and balances in our legislative system. Obviously, we do it at the national level. But if you think down to the local level, we don't have that same bias. In other words, we don't have bicameral city councils, right? So almost every city council or form of council government, commission government, whatever it is at the local level, is all unicameral. So there's no natural predisposition that this is the way it's got to be at state government, but it's just kind of been the tradition that we've held in the United States. Now, you can see there Jesse Ventura, who has always been one of the more colorful characters in American political life, was elected in 1999. And he was the last person to really seriously put this idea of having a unicameral legislature onto the public agenda. Now, he was an independent. Started out as a Reform Party person, then became an independent after a couple years. And his notion was that with a good streamlined unicameral system, what you'd end up with is essentially taking power away from interest groups. Everything would happen openly in one body, which would be relatively small, and as a consequence of that, what you would see is that the special interests would have less power. One of the reasons why is, within the context of the legislative process, if the House and the Senate don't agree on specific topics of legislation that has been passed, it goes to a conference committee. And the conference committee then irons out differences between a House version of something and a Senate version of something. Now, this is something that takes place in the quote-unquote conference committee, which is not open to the public, right? So these deals are worked out between leaders on both sides of the House and the Senate. And from Ventura's perspective, this is where all the mischief happens and all the malfeasance, and this is where the special interests really have their way. let's do this all in public with one house. Things will move more quickly, be more open, more transparency, and more people will understand what's going on in government because it'll be less complicated. Well, as I mentioned, there are 49 states that are unicameral. Minnesota is not one of them. Basically went nowhere, put a lot of political capital into that. He decided to retire after one term. It's very difficult to be an independent governor, and nothing since then has been really brought up in any serious manner in any state about becoming unicameral. Again, think of what you're asking state legislators to do. They're basically asking to put half of the body out of business. Half of the people will have to leave. Why would I vote as a rational actor to put myself out of the job? So a couple of pros and cons that we've talked about. Basically, the essential idea is that the pros for the unicameral legislature are that the legislation, the process is much more open, more transparent, no conference committees. That bicameral system really is a tool for special interests to influence public policy out of the public view. It would be cheaper, obviously, the same way we talked about with Nebraska. Allegedly there'd be more power vis-a-vis the governor because there would only be one body negotiating with the governor as opposed to both bodies. Also, something that's not necessarily always discussed is the idea that with divided government, one party would control the state legislature here. There would be no divided government, right? No situations in which the House would be of one party and the Senate would be the other. The cons are really that, we've had a system of checks and balances. We've had a fear of legislative power in the United States. It's been part and parcel of our political culture. And it was set up to balance power, and it's worked pretty darn well. Why would we change it, right? And those are the main kind of causes here. Now, again, outlier, Nebraska, right? Every state except for the state of Nebraska has a partisan legislature, meaning there are Democrats and Republicans. There are a few independents, as we saw, but they're few and far between. So in the state of Nebraska, basically they have a nonpartisan state legislature, which means that people aren't divided down along the lines of being Republicans or Democrats. However, for the most part, people know which members of the state legislature identify with the Republican and Democratic Party. But they don't split up along party lines the way they would in, say, Pennsylvania. Some states are more partisan than others. We happen to be what's called a caucus state. So pretty much the most important things in the Pennsylvania state legislature are the Republican and Democratic caucuses in the state Senate, and Republican and Democratic caucuses within the state House. And they meet and they make the decisions on what the party line is going to be, and that's the way that they generally tend to vote. So caucuses are very important. We are really kind of a hyper-partisan state. Not all states are like that. The final thing that we can take a look at is the idea of whether or not you want to have single or multi-member districts. Now, obviously the model at the congressional level is that we have single-member districts. In other words, you carve out X number of districts within the state and one person represents that. That's been a tradition in the United States really since the 1800s. It's not the same case at the state legislative level. So what we see is that there are 17 different senates around the country and 15 houses. So you're basically taking a look at 22 different legislative bodies out of the 99 that have multi-member districts. House and Senate are both multi-members in Alaska, Idaho, Vermont, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Just the House in Arizona, Arkansas, Georgia, Indiana, Maryland, New Hampshire, New Jersey, South Dakota, and Washington, and Nevada. The Senate is multi-member district. In general, what this does is makes it harder for the minority party to get more representation, right? Because if you have multi-member districts, it means that district sizes are larger. There are more people there, right? And as a consequence of that, you can draw the lines to benefit a majority party. Think about redistricting. So how does this work in practice? I tried as hard as I could not to cut off northeastern Pennsylvania in this map, but it is. So if you take a look at the top map, that is a map of the 50 legislative districts in the state of Pennsylvania for the Pennsylvania State Senate. And obviously, the districts, at least territorially, are much larger as you get up into the northern tier of Pennsylvania and out into western Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, because the population density is much lower out there. But then you take a look a little bit around here at the bottom, down towards southeastern Pennsylvania and out into Allegheny County, and there are much smaller districts there because the concentration of population is much heavier, right? So each one of those individual districts there is represented by one person, right? So you see that massive district, I think if I can read correctly, the 25th district, which represents, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it looks like parts of 5 to 6 counties in north central Pennsylvania, right? That's a lot of territory to cover, whereby down here in Philadelphia you see that there are a bunch of senatorial districts which are much more compact. On the other hand, you see in the bottom map, again, this is our legislative districts that will be drawn until the 2020 census comes out. So those are the 203 different districts for the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives, and again, one person for each one of those. Now, let's take a look at our neighboring state here. Here's the state of New Jersey. And New Jersey has a multi-member House of Representatives, right? So the Senate, as you can see here, is 40 seats and the House is 80 seats. And what you see is that this is the district lineup of district seats in New Jersey, and there are 40 districts. For the Senate, there was one person that represents each one of these districts. And then for the House, there are 2 members that represent each one of these districts. So New Jersey has multi-member districts when it comes to their House. But unlike Pennsylvania here, which has very different lines that are drawn for each one of these districts, when we take a look at New Jersey, they represent the same constituency. Right? So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about legislative professionalism in the next discussion.